Hello, it's nice to see you again. I'm Michele from the Children's Room in the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And thank you for joining me today. Part 3 of The Water Horse, written by Dick King-Smith, illustrated by David Parkins, published by Crown Publishers in 1990. And again, this is part 3, and we're starting in with chapter 5, called In the Midst of the Foes. There's a line in a very old hymn that says, "Thou art in the midst of foes." And though none of them realized it, Crusoe was. The first foe came on 4 feet. Early one morning, when Crusoe was 3 months old, Kirsty awoke just before dawn to hear a noise in the distance. It was a sharp, fluty whistle. Mother heard it too, took it for a bird, turned over and went to sleep again. Grumble, wakeful in the early part of the night as old people often are, had dropped off at last. Angus, of course, was in the deepest of sleeps and heard nothing. The whistle came again. Behind the small white house on the cliff top was moorland, great stretches of heather and peat bog where curlew trilled their sad, bubbling cries and the red grouse shouted, "Go back, go back!" But whatever was whistling was coming closer, coming off the moor toward the house. And suddenly an awful thought struck Kirsty so that she jumped out of bed and grabbed a book from her bookcase. It was called Wild Animals of the British Isles and was, because she was interested in such things, a favorite of hers. Something she had been reading in it quite recently rang alarm bells in her mind, and hastily she found the page she wanted. She skimmed hurriedly through life history, yearly life, daily life, food, until she came to voice. A hiss when playful or scared, it read. A squeal when angry. A sharp, fluty whistle. Even as she read it, the noise came again, very near now. The whistle of an otter. Throwing on her bathrobe, Kirsty rushed downstairs, stamped her bare feet into her boots, and dashed out of the house. It was light enough now to see as she ran, a long, low-slung, humpbacked shape crossing the grass toward the goldfish pond. Otters, Kirsty knew, ate all sorts of fish, and to this one, the water horse would be just another different kind. Here's a picture of the otter. She opened her mouth and let out the loudest yell she'd ever yelled in her life, and a very surprised and startled otter turned and galloped away as fast as its short legs would carry it. Kirsty knelt by the pond, panting from the effort of running and from the mixture of fear and anger that had gripped her, and in a moment the sleeping form of Crusoe floated up. His nose poked out and he took a breath and sank again. He had heard nothing of Kirsty's shout, nor, of course, had Angus, but soon Mother and Grumble came hurrying to see what was the matter. "What can we do?" asked Kirsty when she had told them. "The otter might come again." "I doubt it will," said Grumble. "The noise you made was enough to frighten the life out of it. It certainly frightened me, but just in case, we must take steps to protect Crusoe." And that morning, Grumble made a big frame, a wooden frame with wire netting stretched over it, which fitted over the top of the pond like a lid. Throughout the rest of that summer, it remained there, day and night, only lifted off when Crusoe was being fed or played with. The second foe came on 2 feet. It was a month or so later, in the autumn now, and it just so happened that no one was at home. Mother had caught the bus to do the week's shopping, and the others had gone down to the sea to beachcomb and to catch food for Crusoe. He would be safe, they thought, under his wire lid. They had nearly reached the top of the cliff path on their way back, Grumble carrying a load of driftwood and the children a bucket of fish each, when suddenly they heard from the direction of the goldfish pond a sudden, loud, harsh, croaking noise. "Frag!" was what it sounded like, and it was repeated hurriedly, frantically, it seemed. "Frag! Frag! Frag! Quick!" shouted Grumble, throwing down his load. "Put down those buckets and run." "What is it?" cried the children. "A heron." "Oh no," thought Kirsty as she ran. Not only had she read about them in her book, but she had seen a heron before now, standing in the shallows of the Lochen on its long legs, long neck outstretched, peering forward into the water. She had seen it pause, motionless, and then with lightning speed stab downward with its long yellow beak and spear a fish. But the scene that met their eyes was more comic than tragic. The heron had indeed tried to stab the water horse, but the point of its beak was now stuck in the wire mesh of the protective frame. "Frank!" cried the bird again, tugging madly to free itself at the sight of the approaching humans, and at last it succeeded, and jumping into the air, flew away with slow flaps of its great curved wings. Here's a picture of it. "There's blood in the water," said Angus somberly, and indeed, the tip of the heron's bill had gone far enough through the wire to nick Crusoe's back. But it was not much more than a scratch, and he did not seem too worried about it. At any rate, he ate all the fish that they had caught with his usual gusto. The third foe came in the winter, not on 4 legs or 2. It had no substance, could not be seen or smelled or heard, but whereas the coming of the first 2 foes was a surprise, the arrival of the third was actually broadcast. One evening early in the new year, Grumble sat listening, as was his custom, to the radio, waiting for the weather forecast so that he could, as was his custom, grumble about it. And then news of the third foe came out of the radio. "Tonight," said a voice, "there will be widespread frost in Scotland. It will be severe in the Highland and Grampian areas, though only slight in the western parts." As usual, the west coast of Scotland was to come off lightly thanks to the warm waters of the Gulf Stream flowing to it across the Atlantic. But the threat of even a slight frost was enough to put Grumble on his guard. On checking it last thing that night, he found the surface of the goldfish pond still unfrozen, protected perhaps by the wire screen, but by first thing next morning there was a thin skin of ice on the pond. Before breakfast, he stood with the children and watched as Crusoe, obviously enjoying himself, rammed his way through the ice, breaking it up with a crackling noise. "He's an icebreaker," shouted Angus, running around the pond, arms outstretched and fingertips together in the shape of a ship's prow. "An icebreaker in the Antarctic. Old Crusoe is full of speed ahead. Crash, bang, wallop." But before too long, he may not be able to break it," said Grumble to Kirsty. "Why not?" "Because they're saying now this is the start of a really cold spell. In a few days' time, a small pond like this could be frozen very thick." "Too thick for Crusoe to break?" said Kirsty. "Could be." "Thick enough to slide on?" said Angus, coming to a halt. "That would be fun." "It wouldn't be any fun for Crusoe, you silly boy," said Kirsty. "If he was stuck under the ice, he couldn't breathe." "He'd drown," said Angus in a solemn voice. He clasped both his hands around his throat and stuck out his tongue, crossed his eyes, and made dreadful gurgling noises of suffocation. "Oh, don't be so stupid," Kirsty said. "Grumble, what can we do?" "We'll have to move him." "To the Lochen?" "Yes, that will never freeze." "But the pike, the otter, the heron." "I reckon he's big enough to look after himself now." And indeed, the water horse, now 10 months old, had grown enormously. The pond had long been empty of animal life, except for him, since he had eaten everything in it, and his demands for food meant that for some time now it had been necessary to make 2 trips a day to the beach. He was as big as, well, it's difficult to measure such an animal against a different one, but since the comparison was first with a kitten, then a cat, you could say that now he looked nothing like one. He was the size and weight of a half-grown tiger. Like a tiger's, his body had grown very long, though of course he did not have legs and feet, but simply those 4 big diamond-shaped flippers. "Big enough to look after himself," said Angus. "Blow me down, I should think he is. I bet he could beat up that old otter and that old heron now, Grumble. He'd shiver their timbers all right." "But how are we going to move him?" asked Kirsty. "That's what's worrying me," said Grumble. "I've waited a bit too long. I had planned to get him into the wheelbarrow somehow, but I doubt I could do that on my own, and I can't ask anyone else or the secret of the water horse would be out, and that would never do. This is the problem. I really need the help of a strong man. What shall we do? Said Kirsty. Let's have breakfast, said Angus. I'm starving. And as they walked toward the house, they caught sight of Posty, the mailman, riding away down the road on his old red bicycle. And when they came into the kitchen, Mother was standing there with an open letter in her hand. She looked very happy. Guess what? She said to the children. It's from your father. His ship berthed in the Clyde yesterday. He'll be home this very morning. Chapter 6, Home is the Sailor. Kirsty was so excited at the thought of Father coming home on leave that she could not manage to eat much. Angus was excited too, but that didn't keep him from finishing his own breakfast and Kirsty's leftovers. Because they knew what time the bus arrived at the stop at the bottom of the glen, they were ready and waiting on the road outside the small white house when the distant blue-clad figure appeared, duffel bag on shoulder, packages under one arm, waving happily with the other. Home is the sailor from the sea, said Grumble contentedly to himself as he watched Mother and the children running to greet him. At first, it was all excitement in the house as the packages were open, presents from far distant lands. For Mother, there was a length of beautiful silk. For Grumble, a packet of strange foreign seeds to plant in the garden. For Kirsty, a necklace made of shark's teeth. And for Angus, a four-masted ship with a full spread of canvas sailing eternally within its bottle. How you've grown, said Father to the children. Why, last leave I was carrying you about easily, Angus. I wouldn't be able to now. He likes his food, said Mother. All this reminded Kirsty of the water horse and how he had grown too heavy to carry. Grumble, she cried, we haven't fed Crusoe yet. Who's Crusoe? Said Father. He's our monster, shouted Angus. We found him on the beach and hatched him in the bathtub, and he lives in the goldfish pond, and we catch fish for him every day, and he gobbles them up, chomp, chomp, chomp. You should see his teeth, Father. Miles bigger than the ones on Kirsty's necklace they are. And Angus made frightening chewing faces. Whatever is the boy talking about, said Father, and the others explained everything to him. You couldn't have come home at a better time, said Grumble. We must get him into the lock-in. The quicker the better, and he's too heavy for me to manage. Getting him out of the goldfish pond won't be easy to begin with, so my idea is not to feed him at all today, and then he'll be so hungry that he might manage to climb out himself if we tempt him with something tasty. Come and see him, Father, said Kirsty, and they all went out to the pond where Crusoe was calling hungrily. They took off the wire frame, and Kirsty said, Crusoe, and the water horse came and laid his head on the rim of the pond. Holy mackerel, said Father. I've sailed the 7 seas and never seen such a creature. Is it some kind of sea serpent? A water horse, said Grumble. I've heard you speak of such a thing. Was there not one in Loch Marar? I think you told me once. Grumble nodded. Gentle him, he said. He's an amiable beastie. And Father bent down and scratched and pulled at Crusoe's ears. When shall we try to move him then, he said. In the morning, I thought, said Grumble. Between us, we can maybe get him into my old wheelbarrow and wheel him down the road to the lock-in. It's a Sunday, so Posty will not be coming, and there's no bus and not likely to be anyone else about. Crusoe had been swimming rapidly up and down the length of the goldfish pond, as he always did as midday approached, raising his horse head at intervals to gaze in the direction of the top of the cliff path. It was at this time that he received his first meal of the day. Now, when he saw the giants approaching, he began to call out impatiently. He could no longer be said to chirrup, for his voice had broken, so that he made a kind of a rough bellow, like a cow with a sore throat calling for its calf. It was a hoarse noise, you might say. And here's a picture of their father petting Crusoe in the water. But when the giants arrived and removed the wire frame, he could see that they had brought no food. Moreover, there were now not 4 of them, but 5. One of the smaller ones called his name. At the sound he came, as he was now accustomed, and he laid his head upon the rim of the pond. The new giant, another very large one, with a good deal of hair on his chin, bent down and scratched and pulled pleasantly at his ears, and they all made their usual medley of sounds, some deep and some shrill. And then they went away, and as they disappeared, a steady, cold rain began to fall. By evening, the rain had stopped, but by then, Crusoe was very hungry. He had had nothing at all to eat for 24 hours now, and his mind was filled with tantalizing visions of food, tender spotted dabs, fat little brown rockfish, and crunchy green crabs and juicy pink starfish. As for mussels, he could have eaten a barrel of them. For the first time in his life, he felt the need to go looking for food instead of waiting for it to be brought to him. And for the first time, he actually tried to get out of the goldfish pond. After a great deal of clumsy effort, he managed to lift the wire frame with his head and get both front flippers up onto the rain-soaked concrete rim. But it was too steep and already frozen, and he slipped back in with a moan of disappointment. That night, the frost was much more severe, but the surface of the pond had no chance to freeze over because Crusoe's hunger pains kept him swimming around urgently. Dawn came, and the sun rose and climbed in the sky and shone down without warmth, and the ravenous water horse bellowed his hunger to the frozen world. And then, at long last, 4 of the giants appeared again, and as they came closer, he could smell the food that they were carrying. Father and the others could see that though there had been a hard frost, Crusoe had kept the pond ice-free, paddling hungrily about. But everything else was ice-covered, for the previous afternoon's rain had frozen solid upon every surface. Even the branches and twigs of the trees were coated in ice. Crusoe came eagerly to the side without waiting to be called. He could smell the fish that Kirsty was carrying on a plate. To everyone's surprise and to Angus's dismay, Mother had donated a small can of herring as bait to lure the water horse out of the pond. Actually, she was delighted to think that he was going somewhere where he could catch his own food from now on, freeing her from the endless washing of clothes covered in slimy fish scales. "Hold one of the herring in front of his nose, Kirsty," said Grumble. "Not too near, mind. Don't let him get it yet." Frantically, Crusoe tried to haul himself out, but the icy rim was too slippery. "Right," said Father, "we'll have to help him." The moving of heavy weights in and out of ship's holds was something he well understood, and now he took charge. "Angus," he said, "take station abaft me. I reckon this fellow weighs closer to 200 pounds than 100, and we don't want anyone getting hurt. Kirsty, keep the fish right in front of his face, but be ready to go full astern as he comes out." And to Grumble, he said, "Next time he comes up on the rim, I'll take a hold of one front flipper, and you take the other and wait for my word. Ready? Now, Kirsty!" And as Crusoe reared up once again, Father and Grumble each grabbed a flipper. "Heave!" shouted Father, and "Heave!" while Angus danced around yelling, "Come on, my hearties!" And at last, with much grunting and sloshing, the water horse came out of the goldfish pond and lay dripping on the frozen grass. "Belay," said Father to Grumble, and to Kirsty, "Give him the fish." "Phew," said Grumble, "he is heavy. I doubt we'll get him into the wheelbarrow." "If we did," said Father, "and it didn't break under him, I doubt we could push him. Let's see first if he'll sail under his own steam." And so began a slow procession from the pond across the lawn toward the road. Crusoe's grace and speed on or underwater was equaled only by his clumsiness and sluggishness on land. But driven on by his hunger, he followed Kirsty and her herring, slowly, oh so slowly, inching along at tortoise speed. "What a rate of knots," said Father, looking at his watch. "Half an hour to travel 50 yards? "We'll be here all day and night getting him to the lock-in," growled Grumble, but then something happened that changed the whole picture. Kirsty, walking backward still, reached the road at last and stepped off the shoulder onto the tarmac surface. Immediately, her legs shot from under her, and as she fell, the last few herring flew off the plate and landed right in front of the grateful water horse. "Are you all right, Kirsty?" everyone shouted. "Yes," she said, struggling to her feet, "but he's eaten all the fish now. What else can we tempt him with?" "We shan't need to," said Father, grinning. "Why not? Look," said Father, and he found a smooth pebble and skimmed it down the slight slope of the road. On and on it slid, for the rain on the surface of the road had frozen into a thick, slippery surface like a skating rink. "We can slide him," said Grumble, "like a curling stone." And that's exactly what they did. The road was so glassy that Father made Grumble and the children walk on the shoulder for young bones and old bones are easily broken in the fall, he knew, and he took upon himself the job of pushing Crusoe. Here's a picture of him pushing him on the ice. Now their progress was 10 times as fast. Slipping, sliding, slithering, and skidding, the water horse glided down the icy road with no effort on his own part and very little on Father's. And in another half hour or so, they had reached the lock-in a quarter of a mile away. Then it was easy. The edge of the lock-in was close to the road and a little below it, and with one last concerted shove, they launched Crusoe into his new home. It was easy to see his delight at being back in his element again and at finding so much space to swim in. Away he went, head and neck showing above the surface, like a periscope, a V-shaped weight streaming out behind him until he reached the middle of the lock-in. Then he turned and for a moment looked back at them standing on the shore. Then he slid silently beneath the surface and was lost to their sight. And we're going to stop there for today. We've been reading The Water Horse by Dick King-Smith, illustrated by David Parkins, published by Crown Publishers in 1990. I'm Michele from the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'll see you next time.